I don't know about you folks, but I love the Great Lakes. From an early age, I recognize that we benefit so much. I wake up like 40 million people. I depend on them for drinking water. I get nourishment from the fish that we eat that live in the water. I recognize that the watershed itself actually contributes to most of the nutritious locally grown food that I eat. Made possible by the Great Lakes, and in all likelihood, our cities and towns around the Great Lakes wouldn't even exist if it wasn't for them. I certainly know that Toronto wouldn't be. Settlers and the Aboriginal people before them depended on the lakes that sustained them much in the same way that we do today. Not only for the security of clean water for the population, but also for the manufacturing and for the farming that goes on in the basin. And critically important was transportation of goods and people and the movements around the lakes that contribute to the sustainability of our economy. Now, the Great Lakes also contribute to our tourism. People like to come to their shores to do various things, and towns and cities benefit from this recreational activity. The beaches, marinas, trails, cliffs, and bluffs, the natural features are unmatched around the world, so no doubt people would want to come here to swim, to fish, to sail, to paddle. But most importantly, our souls are nourished by this natural beauty. From an early age, my family was actually the resident house sitters for Ward's Island. And so I grew up learning to swim on Ward's Island Beach in Lake Ontario. And one of my first dates was actually on the shores of the Great Lakes at Ontario Place Park, where later, much later, I would take a ferry from to cross that same harbor to Algonquin Island, where I was married just a couple of years ago. In almost the exact same place my dad was married, overlooking the inner harbor. Now, I biked Manitoulin Island with my family growing up, camping on the beaches of Lake Huron. I birded Peely Island with my wife along the shores of Lake Erie, and of course enjoying the local perch and the great wine almost as much as we enjoyed the birds. We watched the sun go down over the sleeping giant in the distance outside of Thunder Bay. I'm sorry, I don't have any stories about Lake Michigan. None of it's in Ontario. Sadly, I'm sure we'll get to rectify that over my lifetime. Now, this unique place on earth means so much to so many people. Why are we gambling with its future? Simply put, why are we gambling with its future? Now, some people might not know this, but before I was in politics, I worked on Great Lakes policy at Environmental Defense. I worked with organizations in Canada and the US to get governments to pay more attention to the health of the lakes. We fought to make sure governments did more and everything they could to ensure that our lakes were protected for future generations. I served on the boards of Great Lakes United and Freshwater Future, meeting great people from across the watershed, some of which you'll meet here tonight. Now, we're going to hear some compelling reasons why we shouldn't foolishly put ourselves at such a great risk. We will hear that residents across both borders have recognized this, with almost 90,000 people signing a petition against the proposed nuclear waste disposal site. That's 90,000 people is a good number. We're going to hear about cities and towns that have recognized this as well. 175 resolutions have been passed opposing the OPG plan. And Toronto recognized this. The last term of council, and possibly the most divisive city council of memory, my motion opposing the OPG plan passed unanimously. Those of you from Toronto know that it's no easy thing to get our former mayor to vote for something like this, but we did. Who are we kidding? Everyone knows how difficult it was to get him to do anything. All this hard work is thanks to the dedicated activists of Stop the Great Lakes Nuclear Dump, the nonprofit whose unending commitment and energy to fight OPG's proposal by keeping the issue in the news, keeping it on people's minds, and keeping politicians on their toes, Ontario politicians on their toes, are who we should be thanking for all of this hard work. Thank you very much for that and for tonight. Now, my dad always used to tell me that his life work in politics was because of me and my sister, the next generation. And I never really got this until my wife told me she was pregnant with our first child. She's actually at home tonight, 8 months pregnant, so I may be leaving a little early for a meeting and then to get home. But now I can fully appreciate what my dad was saying. Now I can't help thinking of a Toronto in a world where my daughter won't enjoy learning to swim on Ward's Island Beach in Lake Ontario, who won't enjoy going with her mom and I to Bird on Peely Island, who won't enjoy biking around Manitoulin Island with us on Lake Huron, or who won't be able to sit and enjoy the sunset over the sleeping giant on Lake Superior. So that's certainly what I'm fighting for, and I hope you're here fighting for equally as important reasons. Now, let's meet some others who are going to join us in that fight. I'd like to introduce our moderator for this evening. Dr. Stephanie Rutherford is an assistant professor in the Environmental and Resource Studies Sciences program at Trent University. Her research inhabits the intersection, stops the intersection between environmental politics and cultural studies. She is the author of Governing the Wild, as well as numerous articles on human relations to the natural world. Stephanie has testified in public hearings around nuclear issues, including presenting on the social acceptability of the deep geologic repository in Kincardine. Let's welcome Stephanie Rutherford.
Hi, thank you, Councillor Layton, for that. I was just telling Mike that his dad was my MP when I lived in Toronto, so I feel very warmly about you, even though this is the first time I'm meeting you. So it is my great honor tonight to introduce this such an accomplished panel of speakers with a wide range of expertise in waste management, in ecology, in community organizing, in municipal and state politics. So we're going to start. I'm going to do an introduction of each speaker in turn. They will talk for about 10 to 15 minutes or less. And then we're going to open it up to a Q&A from the audience. So it's my pleasure to introduce John Jackson, who for the past 30 years in his professional career has focused on waste management issues. And in fact, he teaches waste management at Trent in my department in environmental studies. But he also looks at environmental contamination issues, public participation, and consultation. His experience includes working with Great Lakes United, where he was responsible for GLU's programs on nuclear issues, including radioactive waste, water quality, and water quantity, and binational issues, including the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement and the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Basin Sustainable Water Agreement. John is a Canadian advisor to the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission, a member of the International Joint Commission's Water Quality Board. You have a lot of things to say. It's so long. And I will...
You're using up my time.
Oh my goodness. A member of Ontario's Environmental Appeal Board for 6 years. It's much longer. He's very accomplished, but I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here tonight. I was in the council chambers quite a bit in the past when people in Toronto were talking about shipping their waste up to Kirtland Lake. And part of those difficult and challenging discussions, but here for another and very difficult and challenging issue again. First, I just want to say that Mike's intro just reminded me of how incredibly lucky I've been. Over the past 30 years, I have spent most of my time working with citizens groups all around the Great Lakes Basin, around every one of those lakes on both sides of the border, US and Canada. And the biggest honor and joy that I've had out of all that work, as well as the achievements and seeing what citizens groups are doing everywhere across the Great Lakes Basin, is that they would take me to see their favorite little nook or cranny in their part of the basin that the tourists wouldn't normally get to. And the sharing of those special nooks and crannies. I've been a very lucky person. But on to another issue tonight, and that is the proposal to build a deep geologic repository near the shores of Lake Huron. The role I'm going to play tonight in the beginning here is to just give you an introduction to the subject, so you have a sense of what the proposal is. I won't be, in doing this, going through the critique. It would take a long time, and you're going to hear from other speakers in terms of the critique, and when we get into the discussion into that as well. So I'm giving basically, this is what's being proposed to give you a good sense of that. I trust that the mops are up there. Yes. First, you need to realize there are, in Canadian definitions, 3 types of radioactive waste. And the first is what are called low-level radioactive wastes. These are things like, mops, protective clothing, and relatively reasonable to handle. So not as bad, but still a problem. All radioactive wastes are a problem. The second are what are called intermediate level wastes. And the proposal that we're talking about tonight is for low and intermediate level wastes. But what it is critical that you understand is that intermediate doesn't mean it's wastes that are less critical than the high-level radioactive wastes. Because there are many very high-level radioactive wastes included in the intermediate waste, parts from the core of the reactor, which is incredibly high radiation and which continues to have impacts well into the future, tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years. So you'll often hear around this proposal that we're only doing low and intermediate level wastes, with the implication that it doesn't have the high level waste there, and it does. In Canada, high level waste is defined as only being the used fuel bundles in the nuclear reactor. And so it doesn't mean it's the only high level waste, but it's only the fuel bundles in the reactor. So again, just to remind you, don't fall for that in terms of we are still talking about serious waste tonight. The low and intermediate, with the hazardous waste in the intermediate, I won't keep repeating that, are currently taken from each of OPG's, Ontario Power Generation's plants, nuclear power plants, to a site near the nuclear power plant near Kincardine on Lake Huron. Near Lake Huron, not on Lake Huron, thank goodness. Basically, they're stored at surface in just canisters and so on just below the surface. You can see the tops of the caps of the containers at the surface, but they're basically at surface. So a proposal by Ontario Power Generation, the company that owns and generates these wastes, is to bring all of their wastes, of these wastes, to a site near Kincardine, the same site that they're currently being stored, but to put them into a deep geologic repository well below the surface of the ground, and to move them to that sort of facility. And as you'll hear, there's a lot of controversy around that, but as I said, you'll be hearing that from the other people. To give you a sense of this facility, you see some drawings here, and it's to be buried in sedimentary bedrock. Ironically and interestingly, originally when they were looking at the high-level radioactive wastes for the nuclear fuel bundles, they said the only safe place to put these is in granite in the Canadian Shield in the north. But suddenly the story has changed, and now we're seeing, for example, that this is in a sedimentary rock. The underground facilities, as shown on the right, well, is it your right or your left? It's your right. On the right-hand side of the slide is to put them into canisters, to then dig shafts down into the ground, and to take them in there, sort of backfill, put them into the side aisles, backfill, and move out, and basically close off eventually. Can you go to the next slide now? I've changed the order on this one a bit. Slides are still the same order, but what I'm saying isn't. So this slide gives you a sense of the depth that they're going to be buried at. 680 meters below the ground, and as you can see from that drawing, and this is an Ontario Power Generation diagram that I'm using here, higher, deeper than the CN Tower is high. You also notice from that drawing from OPG that it's about 1 kilometer from Lake Huron, between where they will be stored and out to the lake. And You have to look at the language that's there, and this is some OPG language, not mine, where you see the words stable. Well, what are the degrees of stability? That can be debated. Low permeability, well, how low? Is it low enough to really work? And better, what's that? Right, barriers. How good will the barriers really be? So those are some of the questions I'm sure you'll be hearing from people about later. On the next slide, you'll see that in the original proposal, they said that there would be 200,000 cubic meters brought to this facility, which would take a surface area of about 15 hectares, but the area below the ground, where the actual burial would be, is double that, 30 hectares. Now, however, as the hearings went on, they started saying, well, we think waste as well from decommissioning nuclear power plants around Ontario, and they now have said, we figure it would be double the amount of waste that they had originally planned. Where are we at in the moment in the DGR proposal? We've gone through a long federal hearings process. Many of the people here that I see in the room went to these hearings. There have been 33 days of hearings, and there was a set of hearings in September 2013 and 2 years ago. Those adjourned, and then they decided they needed another set of hearings, and a year later they did more hearings. And I have to say, I have to be amazed and praise the people that I see in this room who basically were at every day of those hearings. It's an incredible effort, and spoke out at the hearings very eloquently about their concerns and the need to make changes. So what has happened then is that the review panel, and the review panel is a panel that was jointly appointed by the federal government, Environment Canada, and the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. And this is the commission that supposedly oversees the operation of the nuclear industry, but one has to question the neutrality in terms of that. So that panel came out with its recommendations, which were basically said, go ahead. A lot of conditions in terms of refinements and so on, but nothing that was going to be of the nature that would stall or stop the proposal, but to go ahead. It's now in the hands of the Federal Minister of the Environment to make a decision. And the Federal Minister of the Environment has now said that they'll be making a decision in December of this year. If you want to raise it as an election issue, it might be worthwhile. Okay, I want to give you a sense before I go in terms of the extent to which we have nuclear facilities all around the Great Lakes Basin. This is a map that we put together which shows nuclear power plants both sides of the border, which shows, and beside every one of those nuclear power plants are waste, disposal facilities all around the border. It's just an incredibly amount of nuclear radioactive waste, radioactive facilities around the border. We've been trying to work to say, hey, this is something that has to be looked at bi-nationally. And under the new Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement that the US and Canadian federal governments signed, they designate chemicals of mutual concern. And so we've started to push and say, hey, radioactive substances, nuclides, should be a chemical of mutual concern that you have to develop a plan to get rid of and to deal with. It's a huge threat to all of us. And we also have started to push to have the federal government require public reporting of the radionuclides that are discharged from all of the nuclear facilities through a program called the National Pollutant Release Inventory. On the final slide, just want to point out that this is one proposal that we're talking about tonight. We sort of, working in the field, call it DGR1. But there's what's also then DGR2. And remember at the beginning I told you about the high-level radioactive waste, which is the fuel bundles. The process is underway now to find by the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, which is an industry organization, although it's in federal legislation, to find a site to bury the high-level radioactive waste from the fuel bundles. They started out that they had 23 communities considering it, and you see those, all the lighter colors. But remaining are 9 facilities. About 6 of those are near the Great Lakes, and 3 of them, you'll see, are quite near Kincardine, quite near the facility that we're talking about tonight. So there's another threat that we have to be looking at and addressing. So thank you, and as I said, you'll now be hearing from people who are going to be bringing more of the details of the criticisms and concerns.
All right, thanks, John. Next, we're going to be hearing from Beverly Fernandez. Beverly is the founding member, or a founding member and spokesperson for Stop the Great Lakes Nuclear Dump. Beverly holds a Bachelor's of Arts degree in psychology from York University. She worked as a human resources manager during her career, including 12 years at York. Beverly's volunteer resume includes working with children with disabilities, students in primary school, the Canadian Cancer Society, and an organization that built and supported a school for children in Afghanistan. She and her husband, Frank, who I'm sure many of you know well, have raised 2 sons who are both currently in university. Beverly has never been an activist, quote unquote, until the seriousness of this issue compelled her to take action.
Thank you, Stephanie, for the introduction. It is a pleasure to be here in Toronto to speak about this very important issue. Stop the Great Lakes Nuclear Dump is a nonprofit citizens group based in Ontario. We are deeply concerned that Ontario Power Generation plans to build this deep underground nuclear waste dump to bury and abandon radioactive nuclear waste about 1 kilometer from the shore of Lake Huron. When we learned of this plan 3 years ago, we decided something had to be done. We formed Stop the Great Lakes Nuclear Dump to raise public awareness and engage Canadians and Americans to take an informed stand to oppose this plan. The billboard that you will see up on the screen is something that our organization put up on the Gardiner Expressway 3 years ago, and it says it all. Bury nuclear waste beside the Great Lakes? Bad idea. Stop the Great Lakes Nuclear Dump recognizes that Ontario has a significant quantity of nuclear waste that must be dealt with, but we must deal with it responsibly. Today I will focus my remarks on why we are concerned about OPG's plan, the growing opposition to this plan, and what we can all do to stop it. It is imperative that we understand the profound importance, absolute necessity, and sanctity of fresh water. Fresh drinkable water is required for life on this planet. Without it, life cannot exist. Fresh water is the new gold. The fresh waters of the Great Lakes are North America's greatest asset. They are an irreplaceable treasure. In some countries of the world, people die every day simply because they do not have fresh water to drink. Enter Ontario Power Generation. They are 100% owned by the Ontario government, and OPG plans to bury the most toxic and lethal waste humans have ever created right beside the life-giving waters of the Great Lakes. As John alluded, this nuclear waste remains radioactive and dangerous for over 100,000 years. OPG cannot and will not provide any guarantees that this nuclear waste dump will not leak and contaminate the Great Lakes. Why should we be concerned about OPG's plan? There are many reasons. Number one, site selection. OPG did not consider any other sites for this nuclear waste dump except right beside the Great Lakes. This slide shows how close this dump is to Lake Huron. In OPG's environmental impact statement of over 3,000 pages, OPG devoted the equivalent of one single page to the issue of site selection. Their submission stated unknown regarding achievability and acceptability of an alternative site option. OPG failed to perform the most basic due diligence in terms of investigating alternate sites. They readily admit that they did not investigate any other sites, and they say they didn't need to because they had a willing host community in the municipality of Kincardine. This is not good enough. The siting of a garbage dump in Canada requires that several sites be considered and that the most suitable site be chosen. OPG didn't consider any other sites. They simply proposed a single site right beside North America's greatest freshwater supply. This is not responsible. As you can see on the slide, Ontario is a vast province, almost 1 million square kilometers, and 87% of Ontario's landmass is owned by the province of Ontario. This begs some obvious questions. Why didn't OPG consider alternative sites on Crown land, far from people and far from the Great Lakes? Why were sites in the Canadian Shield not investigated? And why weren't sites within the Great Lakes Basin disqualified right from the outset? OPG and the Ontario government have no credible answers to these important questions. Number 2, lack of public consultation. OPG has a legal responsibility to engage the public in a meaningful way about its plan. Meaningful public participation means ensuring that citizens, governments, and environmental groups are notified and consulted. According to OPG, they have been communicating with the public for over a decade, and yet millions of Canadians and Americans are still largely unaware of this plan. Perhaps some of you in the audience are learning about this for the first time. How is this possible? With billions of dollars at its disposal, OPG could easily have developed a communications program that would have reached the 40 million people living in the Great Lakes region who obtain their drinking water from the Great Lakes. What actually happened is that OPG's communication effort focused largely on people living in the community of Kincardine and neighboring communities in Bruce County and their elected officials. Many people living in these Bruce County communities are employees and retirees, and they receive a pension or a salary from the nuclear industry. They are clearly in a conflict of interest position. In addition, Kincardine and 4 neighboring communities are receiving $36 million from OPG under a hosting agreement that requires them to express their support for OPG's DGR in exchange for these financial payments. Payments can be cut off if any of these communities fail to show their support. But what about the 40 million people who rely on the Great Lakes for their drinking water? What about the citizens of the City of Toronto and the GTA? What about other communities outside of Bruce County? What about the citizens of Michigan and the 7 other Great Lakes states and their elected representatives, like Senator Pavlo? Essentially, very few outside of Bruce County were informed or consulted. The Great Lakes are all interconnected, as we know. And clearly, all provinces and states connected to the Great Lakes would be concerned about any proposal that may threaten their drinking water. Of course, if you don't contact those communities, they won't know anything about it and won't have an opportunity to provide their views. Here in Canada, if it weren't for the efforts of Stop the Great Lakes nuclear dump, Sarnia Mayor Mike Bradley, and others, OPG's plan would still be flying under the radar. The vast majority of elected officials in Ontario and every Great Lakes state heard about OPG's plan for the very first time when we contacted them. Across the border in the state of Michigan, citizens weren't told or consulted about this nuclear waste dump during the last 10 years. I can tell you they certainly know about this now, thanks to the efforts of Michigan elected officials like Senator Phil Pavlo, Congressman Dan Kildee, U.S. Senator Debbie Stabenow, and Senator Hoon-Yun Hopgood, to name a few. It is abundantly clear that the people of Michigan are deeply concerned and opposed to this nuclear waste repository. Toxicity and longevity of the waste. The proposed nuclear waste dump will entomb low and intermediate level nuclear waste. While the low-level waste remains dangerous for about 300 years, some of the intermediate level waste remains radioactive, toxic, and lethal for 100,000 years. To put this into perspective, the Great Lakes themselves are about 12,000 years old. Number 4, let's talk about geology. OPG is planning to construct the DGR in limestone. Now, I'm not a geologist, but I do know that a deep geological repository is unproven and unprecedented anywhere in the world. The federal panel who endorsed this plan called the DGR a, quote, unique, precedent-setting project, first of its kind in North America, first of its kind in the world to propose using limestone as the host rock formation. The federal panel acknowledges this is an experiment. This is very alarming. Should we be experimenting with our Great Lakes? Dr. William Fife, an international consultant on nuclear waste, a geologist, professor emeritus at Western University, and among the world's most eminent geochemists, had this to say, quote, "You do not put nuclear waste near things like the Great Lakes or the Great Rivers in case there's a leakage that you haven't expected," end quote. The fact of the matter is that no scientist or geologist can guarantee that this nuclear waste dump will not leak and contaminate the Great Lakes. OPG cannot and will not provide any such guarantee. Number 5, there are only 3 DGRs on the planet that have held nuclear waste, and they have all leaked, despite assurances that this would not happen. Let me begin by telling you about Maxey Flats, Kentucky. To be clear, Maxey Flats is not a DGR, but it is a nuclear waste dump. What is important about Maxey Flats is the assurances provided to citizens by the experts. They were told that the possibility of off-site migration of the waste was, quote, essentially non-existent. Citizens were told it would take 24,000 years for the plutonium to travel half an inch. Less than 10 years later, it was found 2 miles off-site. Now let's compare this to what OPG is saying about their proposed nuclear waste dump. OPG says it will take 10 million years for a water particle to move 1 meter. Isn't that a fantastic statement? They can tell you exactly what will happen in 10 million years. What OPG won't tell you is that every DGR on our planet has leaked. And I can tell you it didn't take 10 million years for this to happen. Let me tell you about ASA 2 in Germany, and this is a deep geological repository. It was intended to permanently house low and intermediate level waste underground in a salt mine. And under a very strict government approval process, the government and the scientists assured the people that the DGR would not leak. ASA 2 was supposed to remain a completely dry and non-corrosive environment. 10 years after nuclear waste was buried in ASA 2, 12,000 liters of water per day started leaking into the supposedly dry and non-corrosive environment. The groundwater is contaminated. The scientists and geologists were completely wrong. ASA 2 is an unmitigated disaster to this day. And the story is very similar for a second DGR in Germany called Morsleben, which has also leaked. Let me tell you about the DGR in New Mexico, USA, called the Waste Isolation Pilot Project, or WIP for short. WIP is the only operating DGR on the planet. The Concardant DGR is very similar in both depth and design to WIP. WIP was designed to hold nuclear waste from the U.S. Defense Program, and the scientists, once again, and the geologists, assured the public that WIP would never leak. Sound familiar? During the public hearings, OPG held up WIP as a shining example of a DGR with a successful track record. WIP formed an important part of their safety case. Citizens in New Mexico were assured that WIPP would safely contain its nuclear waste for 10,000 years. Unfortunately, things did not turn out quite as planned. A mere 15 years into its operation, on February 14th of 2014, a drum containing nuclear waste exploded underground. The radioactive contaminants traveled up the shaft to the surface and indeed traveled to the next town. By sheer luck, no workers were present in the repository that day. 22 workers on the surface were exposed to radioactive contamination. This could have been far worse if the explosion had occurred when WIPP was filled with hundreds of workers. WIPP is currently closed down while the U.S. Department of Energy tries to deal with this mess. The point here is, again, this was not supposed to happen. The fact of the matter is that there is not a single DGR on our entire planet that has not leaked. And OPG wants to bury and abandon radioactive nuclear waste about 1 kilometer from the Great Lakes. So as you can see, there are many compelling reasons to be alarmed about OPG's plan. Quite simply, burying radioactive nuclear waste about 1 kilometer from the shore of the Great Lakes, the largest source of fresh water in the world, and the supply of drinking water for 40 million people in 2 countries, defies common sense. Would you bury poison beside your well? There is significant opposition to OPG's plan. The Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Cities Initiative, a group of 115 mayors representing over 17 million people, are opposed to this plan. Mayor Mike Bradley recognized the dangers of this plan and brought this issue to the city's initiative more than 3 years ago. Stop the Great Lakes Nuclear Dump has been very active in raising awareness about this issue with local governments all around the Great Lakes in both Canada and the US. And many of these communities are standing up and voicing their concern and opposition by passing resolutions. Thanks to the efforts of Senator Pavlo, many cities, towns, and counties in Michigan have passed resolutions. If you take a look at the resolution map on the screen, you will see that there are currently 175 resolutions that have been passed in Canada and the US opposing a DGR. And the population of these communities is over 22 million people. I'm very proud to tell you that through a significant and effective outreach effort by our organization, 59 local governments in Ontario and in every Great Lakes state, including the City of Toronto and the City of Chicago, have passed resolutions opposing OPG's plan, or any nuclear waste repository in the Great Lakes Basin. Both the National Association of Counties and the Great Lakes Legislative Caucus have passed resolutions, and Senator Pavlo was responsible for bringing this issue to the Great Lakes Legislative Caucus. The Michigan Senate is unanimously opposed to this plan. Resolutions and a bill have been introduced into the U.S. Congress by Senator Debbie Stabenow and by Congressman Dan Kildee. Although Congressman Dan Kildee could not be here today, he forwarded a tape message, which we would like to play for you now.
Hello, I'm Congressman Dan Kildee. I'm sorry I'm unable to make it to today's town hall meeting, but it's a pleasure to join you remotely as I work with you from Washington to protect our Great Lakes from the threat of nuclear waste. The Great Lakes are one of our greatest natural resources. Like many of you, I grew up visiting the lakes with my family, and it is our duty to protect them for current and future generations. Our lives and our livelihoods depend upon the Great Lakes. Over 40 million people depend on them for drinking water, and the lakes produce billions of dollars every year, creating jobs in the boating, tourism, and fishing industries. That's why I think it's too big of a risk to take to permanently bury and store nuclear waste less than a mile from the Great Lakes. We must also address temporary storage of nuclear waste along our lakeshore, which also poses a threat to our waterways. But the Kincardine plan would be a permanent facility and represents a more urgent threat to our Great Lakes. Surely in the vast landmass that comprises Canada, there must be a better location to permanently store nuclear waste than on the shores of Lake Huron. So in Congress, I've led a bipartisan effort to stop this plan from moving forward. I've introduced a resolution in opposition to this nuclear waste storage site that has 22 co-sponsors, 11 Democrats and 11 Republicans, including one from every Great Lakes state. If it passes, Congress would join the 174 and counting state, local, and municipal governments on both sides of the border who have passed similar resolutions. Last month, I also introduced a bill to use the Boundary Waters Treaty of 1909 to mandate that the International Joint Commission study be conducted to examine the risks of this dangerous proposal. We must protect the Great Lakes now and for future generations. I'll continue to partner with you to stop this facility from being built near our shared water basin. Thanks for all you have done and will continue to do in this effort to stop this ill-conceived plan.
The Stop the Great Lakes Nuclear Dump petition has attracted almost 87,000 signatures and over 30,000 comments. People from every Canadian province and territory, all 50 U.S. states, and 145 countries from around the world have signed the petition. So as you can see, there is a lot of opposition to this plan. So how do we stop this plan? Well, first, let's hear from our other panelists, and I will come back to address this later.
Thanks, Beverly. Next, we have Dr. Faisal Mullah, who is one of Canada's most respected environmental scientists and advocates. His research on ecology and environmental policy has been published in numerous academic journals and award-winning books, and he's a regular contributor to the opinion pages of Canada's leading newspapers. For the past decade, he has led a team of expert scientists and policy experts and communicators at the David Suzuki Foundation in support of the protection of Canada's cherished wild spaces and endangered species. He's been at the forefront of where am I? You're all so impressive. It's a lot to read. He's been at the forefront of Canada's most iconic environmental battles, including successful efforts to protect BC's Great Bear Rainforest and efforts to pass a national law to protect endangered species throughout the country. After living for several years on the West Coast, we are happy to have Faisal back in the Greater Toronto area, where he was born and raised. He is the Director General for Ontario and Canada's North at the David Suzuki Foundation, and has an adjunct faculty appointment both at the University of Toronto and York University.
Good evening, and thank you very much. I bring greetings from David Suzuki. David cares very, very deeply about this issue, and some of you know he wrote an op-ed that was published across the country in over 100 newspapers. It went out to over 500,000 people on social media, over 100,000 people on emails. Unfortunately, David wasn't able to join us today because he's traveling. But the comments that I'm sharing are very much consistent with David's own opinions about this project. As we heard from Beverly, this project is unprecedented in terms of its ecological impacts. It's unprecedented in terms of its impacts on communities. And what's really alarming is that these impacts are extremely long-lived. But at the same time, I'm not surprised that the Joint Review Panel approved this project and that governments have not acted in a precautionary way to stop this project outright. Indeed, the way that this project has proceeded seems very familiar to me. I've seen this sort of thing happen when it comes to other mega infrastructure projects around the country. And largely this is a consequence of the fact that when we look at these projects, we tend to look at them at the wrong scale. We need to look at the big picture, and I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to talk about that. We oftentimes don't look at the consequences of not just an individual project, but the cumulative impacts of all the types of development that are occurring within a given geography. And as we heard from Beverly, the Great Lakes are one of those areas that are being impacted by lots of different things all operating on the same land base. We also know that this is an irreplaceable part of the planet. It's one of the most picturesque places in Canada. I've been in some of the most beautiful parts in Canada, and every single summer spend time recreating on the shores of Lake Huron. It's also one of the most sensitive ecological places in the country as well. There are rare dune ecosystems with rare assemblages of plants and animals. There's, of course, wetlands and forests and some of the best farmland found in North America. And, of course, there are those iconic rivers that flow into this incredible system of lakes called the Great Lakes. And although we don't give it much thought, it's the farms, it's the forests, it's those fields and rivers and other ecosystems that are in and around our communities that provide an astonishing suite of ecological benefits. Trees clean our air, wetlands filter our water, forests remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and therefore help us fight the global warming problem. And this doesn't even just account for the health and psychological, and for many people, the spiritual benefits of spending time in close association with nature, something that Indigenous people have known for tens of thousands of years. Now, the ecosystems that provide these benefits, scientists, we refer to those as natural capital. The fields, the farms, the forests, the wetlands, the Great Lakes, that, as David reminds us, literally form the life support systems of our families and our communities. They provide clean air, they provide safe drinking water for us to drink, and healthy food for us to eat. As biological creatures, we depend on nature, like the Great Lakes, and the ecological services that it provides sustain the health and well-being of our communities. But too often, these benefits are taken for granted by policymakers. When faced with a decision that could potentially degrade, or as we've heard, destroy ecosystems, despite their enormous value to sustaining not just the health of the environment, but the health of our economy as well. Sustainability expert Paul Hawken has remarked that while there's no truly right way to value a river or a forest or farmland or the Great Lakes, there's definitely a wrong way, which is to give it no value whatsoever when we make decisions that could potentially degrade or destroy the natural world. And unfortunately, that's exactly what we do. Most of the services that we get from nature, clean air, clean water, healthy food to eat, they're treated as if they have no value whatsoever. In fact, economists actually have a term for that. We call them externalities. They're externalities to the decision with the assumption that the degradation and the loss of nature will have little or no consequence for the health of our communities and the health of our economies. This is short-sighted. One of my colleagues, Dr. Nancy Alleweiler at Simon Fraser University, has argued that protecting the local environment results in cash savings for governments because replacing the benefits that we get from nature for free with engineered and manufactured substitutes, such as water filtration, plants or retention walls, can cost hundreds of millions of dollars, often for a lesser level of service than nature is able to provide for free. So in addition to the ecological rationale for protecting places like the Great Lakes, there is a fiscal rationale as well because of all of these services that we get from nature, which are incredibly expensive, if not impossible to replace if they're degraded or destroyed by something like this proposal to bury toxic nuclear waste within this very, very sensitive basin. Providing clean drinking water at an affordable cost to Canadians and Americans is a challenge because many of our communities, so few of our communities, actually get our drinking water from pristine and protected watersheds. So we have to rely on expensive treatment systems because the ecosystems from which we take water from have been degraded or otherwise tainted. Why on earth then would we intentionally put our water at greater risk? As we've heard, the Great Lakes are the source of drinking water for over 40 million people, and they're already under enormous stress from pollution, agricultural runoff, invasive species, climate change, and more. We cannot afford to risk a radioactive contamination of one of the world's largest sources of fresh drinking water. Indeed, OPG's plans are foolhardy and, to be honest, irresponsible when you look at how precious the Great Lakes are and how they would be irrevocably changed forever should there be a radioactive accident. And that's already happened, as we've heard from Beverly. And of course, there are those other radioactive accidents that have happened, places like 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and most recently, Fukushima. So is dilution really the solution to pollution? As the old saying says, when it's nuclear waste that can stick around for 100,000 years? Well, the Joint Review Panel seems to think that's the case. And they've essentially told 40 million of us that we shouldn't worry because the release of radioactive material into the Great Lakes would be acceptable because they believe that the amount of nuclear material that would be released into the environment is small compared to Lake Huron's water volume and the quantity of rain that falls into it. Proponents have told the Joint Review Panel that leaking waste would be diluted by active streams and marshes. They've actually said that, quote, the volumes of the bodies of water available for dilution at the surface are either immense or actively flowing. So the dilution capacity is significant. Let's be clear here. The proponents of this project are essentially saying that we need to assume that nature, in this case forests and wetlands and riparian vegetation in and around the site, as well as the Great Lakes Basin, can themselves effectively mitigate the impacts of a nuclear waste accident. In other words, we are relying in part on nature to be ready to clean up the mess should a spill occur, but at the same time we fail to recognize that the value of these true ecosystems to our communities and our economies. Earlier this year, renowned scientist David Suzuki, who I work with, published an op-ed in a number of papers, as I mentioned, about this project. David argued that our out-of-sight, out-of-mind mentality has to end when it comes to the waste products of our economy. We can't continue to dump garbage into the oceans, waterways, and air, or bury it in the ground and hope it will disappear forever. I couldn't agree more. I want to end with a very remarkable quote that was written by a renowned American poet by the name of Gary Snyder. Gary Snyder said that the most radical thing that anyone can do is to stay home. Kind of interesting thing to say. What he was referring to is that we all have a sense of place, and there's a profound sense of communities coming together to protect the people and places that we love. Sometimes the people that are fighting to protect the people and the places they love, they're referred to as radicals. There's nothing radical about it. But bear with me for a moment. I'm a radical. You're a radical. You know why? Because the word radical originates from the Latin word for root, or having roots. For many people, their connection to the Great Lakes is deeply rooted, and we're not going to be easily moved. I have no doubt in the end of the day that people power will prevail. It did when we stopped the Melanchthon mega quarry, which would have destroyed farmland and forests and drinking water. And there is no doubt in my mind that through people power, we will stop this project as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Faisal. Now we have Mayor Mike Bradley, the Mayor of Sarnia, Ontario, who holds the distinction of being the second longest serving mayor in the province of Ontario. He was elected in 1988. I feel like, yeah, So we're celebrating. He tirelessly champions and advocates for the disabled and the intellectually challenged, civil liberties, security, environmental issues, open government, and a whole range of other important social, economic, and political issues. He's held positions on boards and organizations too numerous to list, but some of them include the Legion, Rotary, Queen's Medals, Community Living, and been involved in provincial ministers and the lieutenant government, and so been recognized by provincial ministers and the lieutenant government. Mayor Bradley is also a frequent and much sought-after media commentator and is a well-known voice on local, provincial, national, and international issues. He is the leading political voice of the opposition in Canada on the nuclear waste dump's proposed location on the Great Lakes, an issue that came to the public's attention only 3 years ago, in large part because of Mayor Bradley's tenacity to speak out about it.
Well, one of the things I've learned, if everyone else has covered off what you're going to say, is to be brief and to be seated. A couple of points I do want to make. I think the first question is, why is the mayor of Sarnia here? I'll tell you why I'm here. I'm not an expert, but I do have common sense. And I don't have, growing up here, that same linkage with the Great Lakes. I grew up in Australia, near the outback. And I have to say, when we came to this country, it was a real challenge because I couldn't speak either official language. But my point is this: water was a precious resource for us. I mean, it really was. People lost their lives because they couldn't get from one place to another and didn't have water. So we came to Sarnia in the late 60s. Parents Irish, myself born in Australia. Knew no one, but they came there for work. And at that time, it was the highest per capita income community in the country because of the petrochemical industry. And it was mentioned, dilution being the solution. That was the motto of the community. People simply didn't know better. And I can tell you, when I became mayor in '88, it was just after the infamous blob had occurred in the St. Clair River, where dry cleaning fluid had come together to create this massive image of pollution. And the attitude of the political people up to that time was, it's a public relations problem. If they just understood us and how important what we do is important to the Canadian economy. It was then and it is now. But my approach was, it's not a public relations problem. Let's just fix the problem. And unfortunately, in politics, when you speak out, and just remember, this is a single industry town, and taking on and challenging those industries, because they were located there for a reason, because of the water, because of the St. Clair River. And that was the technology of the time. But taking them on, you're instantly labeled as anti-business, anti-jobs. And I'm fortunate enough to say the public stuck with me over those years, and there was some of it was generational change, that recognized there was no trade-off. You can have jobs, and you can have the environment where you want it to be. And people like John know this. We've gone from the St. Clair River through to Detroit being a sewer, to our hope in the next number of years is going to be delisted on the Great Lakes as a hotspot. And even 10 years ago, when Shell was looking to build a major refinery in Sarnia, wasn't going to be on the river, was going to be totally isolated from any damage to the river or the Great Lakes. So they learned their lesson. So 3 or 4 years ago, when I first heard about this and started to look into it, I just couldn't believe it. I honestly couldn't believe it. And you've heard about all the cities that have joined the crusade, and I appreciate our American friends who have come on board, because they are key to this, along with the First Nations, in eventual success. That's how we stopped the nuclear steam generators from being transported through the Great Lakes to Europe. We did that. But you know, it's been a difficult challenge because we're against a very powerful organization. They employ people in my community. At one point, they employed about 400 or 500. They sponsored one of my speaking events last year. And they knew that, and I knew that, And I said, look, this is what I do. This is my responsibility. You know, on the Great Lakes, and there was reference from Mike Layton about the former mayor here, Rob Ford. And I have to say, I really miss Rob Ford as the mayor. No, I do. Because even in the last election, when people were attacking me, I said, you think I'm bad? You should go to Toronto and take a look at him. But the mayor before that, David Miller, was a real ally for us. And David Miller stood side by side with Mayor Daley of Chicago and myself and other mayors. We stopped, and this is what gets to me. This is what really gets to me. You would think 10, 20 years, we've learned things. It was only about 10 years ago, the American Coast Guard wanted to have live fire machine gun exercises on the Great Lakes. We've had efforts in Ontario to put wind turbines into the Great Lakes, oil and gas drilling. So my point is, it's just perpetual. Every time you think we've advanced with our sophistication about the environment, we turn around and there's someone saying, well, we can do it, and it'll be safe. And we've done it all. We've all been up to the repository. We've done the tour. We've listened. And I can't, again, argue the science. I'm not equipped to. That's not my skill. But I recall being where it was and seeing Lake Huron. That's all I needed to think about on the way home. It's that close. Sarnia is the biggest city on Lake Huron. Our water intake is right at the foot of the Blue Water Bridge, and we'd be the first major city impacted if something goes wrong. I just want to conclude by saying that I just don't get it. Why over the years we continue to treat the Great Lakes like a toilet bowl. You know, I thought we'd lost that dilution as a solution. I thought we had. And this is the first major challenge as we came into this century that we've had to fight off. And I honestly believe that we can be successful just as we have been on other issues. And we shouldn't have to be in that position. There's some very powerful interests at play here, both federally and provincially and in the private sector. But you know, one of my, when I first came to Canada, there's always a, you know, I'm a child of TV when I was growing up. And I always remember there was a commercial, some of you might remember. It used to run late night TV, which back in those days was like 11 or 12 o'clock at night. And it was a back shot of, in the United States you would call an Indian, in Canada you would say First Nations. And it was with a small headdress, and it was just a back shot. And it was a black and white commercial. And it stuck with me as a young man, young teenager. And he was surveying, and you couldn't see his face. He was surveying this vast industrial wasteland with smoke and rivers on fire, and just, it was like something out of a post-nuclear war. And then he turned around slowly, and just a single tear came down from his eye. And it was such a reflection of what he was witnessing. And I have to believe if this proposal moves forward, if you were to make that same commercial, he'd turn around and there'd be 2 tears. And there'd be tears that we would feel and would feel for a long time. This is one that we have to win. And there was some poetry quoted earlier, and I just want to close by saying, I want to quote from Helen Keller. And it's what this is all about, of bringing together First Nations and this different alliances of people, and these great people that have done this great work on this issue. And Keller said that alone we can do so little, together we can do so much. And that's what this is about. We keep on growing this, and together we will do this, and we will stop this proposal. So with that, I thank you.
Okay, so our last speaker for the evening is Senator Phil Pavlo. Senator Pavlo is currently serving his 2nd term in the Michigan Senate, representing the people of Huron, Sanilac, and the St. Clair counties, along with Armada, Memphis, New Baltimore, and Richmond and Macomb County. These areas include much of the Lake Huron shoreline. He is a member of the Republican caucus and serves as the chair of the Senate Education Committee. He serves as the vice chair of the Appropriations Subcommittee for School Aid, vice chair of the Senate Natural Resources, Environment, and Great Lakes Committee, vice chair of the Human Services Committee, and as a member of the Transportation Committee.
Well, thank you very much. And if you didn't hear, Mayor Bradley mentioned I'm a Tigers fan as well. Congratulations on your success in Toronto here. And it's a pleasure to be invited. Frank and Beverly Fernandez extended an invitation to me, and we moved some things around to be here today. I think it's very important because it was about a year and a half ago that I had invited Frank and Beverly to my community in Port Huron, where we held a similar town hall forum and began this conversation in a very public way. And I'm here today to report from Michigan that we have not found community acceptance for this project in the state of Michigan. I think one of the areas that has really consumed my interest in this project is I was one of the people that was still standing after being in 4 of the Great Lakes, certainly not 5. And I think there are people in Michigan that would almost make the case to say Lake St. Clair could potentially be the 6th Great Lake. I'm not coming to Toronto today to bring that conversation to you, but I will remind you that it is the world's best bass fishing lake on the planet. So please come to Lake St. Clair and visit our district. I'm fortunate enough to be able to share the other side of the St. Clair River with Mayor Bradley, and we certainly have our challenges being in an industrial area. And my work with the Canadian government really began when I was a county commissioner in 2003, where we started working closely with developing a better and stronger communication system between our two countries as it related to notification on spills that would happen. We certainly have had a number of stormwater and sewage spills in the St. Clair River, while we have also had, on the other side of Chemical Valley, we've had some significant spills along the way. And I think part of the thing that we've been able to do is be able to have that communication, which is absolutely key. And I would say that the work that we've been doing on this nuclear waste dump in Kincardine is also under the category of good communication. When we began looking at how we could affect this project from Michigan's perspective, I'm not naive to say that we can pass a law in the Michigan Senate that would somehow affect or impact the province of Ontario, and that isn't certainly not my intent. But what we did find through our deep research, as Representative Kildee had mentioned, I'm glad that Representative Kildee and U.S. Senator Debbie Stabenow have also joined our fight, because it was a year ago that the Michigan Senate voted unanimously to engage the International Joint Commission. And that is the tool that I found that was probably the most effective tool that we have. And it essentially is the 1909 Boundary Waters Treaty. We share a boundary. So back in 1909, our framers of that treaty had the forethought to be thinking about resolution and dispute resolution among the Great Lakes. And there is where was formed the International Joint Commission. And so the first resolution that we passed unanimously in June of 2014 was a resolution urging President Obama and Secretary of State John Kerry to invoke Article 9 of the Boundary Waters Treaty. And that is a unilateral, that would be the United States making a request to study this very important project. We also included another provision in Article 10 that would allow the government of Canada and the United States to join in this study. And that has not been done since 1909. But I thought it was important to add it there because I think that we share a keen interest in the outcome of what this project would be. We took another approach also to inject the Great Lakes Commission. The Great Lakes Commission is another policy advisory council that deals with all 8 states and the 2 provinces of the Great Lakes. And folks, we can't be looking at this as a Lake Huron issue. We've got to broaden this out to make it a basin-wide issue. We need to have our friends in Wisconsin, Indiana, Illinois, Pennsylvania, New York, Ontario, Quebec. We need all hands on deck when it comes time to matters of the Great Lakes. And it isn't like if a disaster were to happen that suddenly we would just isolate Lake Huron from there, because Lake Huron turns into the St. Clair River, which turns into Lake St. Clair, the Detroit River, the Lake Erie, Lake Ontario, and the St. Lawrence Seaway. And we've infected the eastern portion of the world's largest facilities of Great Lakes and fresh water. The thing that I found very interesting is that I wasn't in politics in the early 1990s when Michigan took a very firm stance from a basin perspective and from really a leadership perspective. When we eliminated and outlawed any potential burying of any kind of nuclear waste, whether it be low, intermediate, or high level. We put a moratorium on that in the early 90s. And I passed a bill out of the Michigan Senate that not only recognized that moratorium, but we added an additional class just to make sure going forward that the highest level of low-level radioactive waste was never going to find its home in Michigan. And I think that that's very key. As we did our research and we started working more and more on this issue, it became clear that there was going to be some resistance to this, as you can imagine. The regulatory climate in Ontario is very different than it is in Michigan. Yet we still have the powers of the Boundary Waters Treaty to be able to engage and to leverage. And so that's where I think we really need to be focusing our attention on, all the while keeping an eye on what's happening through the hearing process. And I was fortunate enough to get an opportunity to speak to the panel on September 11th of last year. And we raised our concerns. We talked about what we had done in the state of Michigan. And I also, I want to read something that came from a similar conversation when there was a proposed nuclear facility, a waste facility going on in Maine. And I want to pick this up right here. It's interesting because Canada has demonstrated a similar lack of community acceptance for these projects in the past. In fact, the Canadian government itself formally objected to the U.S. Department of Energy and the U.S. Department of studying a number of locations for a DRG along the Canadian border. In a statement dated January 16th, 1986, the Honorable Joe Clark, Canada's then Secretary of State for External Affairs, expressed opposition to any development that could present a transboundary threat to the welfare of the Canadian or the integrity of the Canadian environment. Specifically, the foreign minister's statement opposed a potential site in Maine, the Bottle Lake Complex, located within 25 miles of the border and possibly, at least particularly, in the St. Croix River watershed. I think it's important to note that if in 1986 it wasn't acceptable for the United States to breach within 25 miles of the boundaries of the water of Canada, I think that that same principle should be applied. And as I sat through the hearings for the Joint Review Panel, it became clear between OPG, the independent panel, and the Ontario Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Safety Commission, that they had one thing in common. There was really no agreement on what should be done with this. And any time I've been a part of an environmental impact study, one of the impact studies that we always have to look at is the no-build option. Not only was the no-build option considered in this process, other options weren't considered in a very fruitful way either, in my opinion. The potential burial in the Canadian Shield was only slightly reviewed, if you will. There were no test bores, there were no serious considerations into finding an alternative site for it. They did hypothetical studies and they did modeling and things like that, but not a real interest in it because I didn't think that there was any real intent of moving this material any further north. I think that the conclusion was made. And I think I expressed that in my comments, and I've written on it, and we've put op-eds out there, and we've made our position very clear. I'm honored to be part of this panel because I'm certainly interested in telling the story. We have had 75 different same resolutions passed in different municipalities across the thumb, and you had an opportunity to see the map. But again, I think we need to make sure that this becomes a basin-wide issue and not just necessarily a Lake Huron issue. And we have to add a stronger voice to what we're talking about because we are talking about things that last for hundreds of thousands of years. We can talk about the strength of the formation and we can talk about all the geological elements and components of this proposal. You will never be able to remove the human element from this process. I appreciate the opportunity and the invitation to come here tonight, and I look forward to hearing the rest of the panel, and we'll turn it over to the moderator. Thank you.
Okay, So thank you for the compelling interventions put forward by the full panel. We're going to open it up for questions, but before we do, Beverly ended her piece with the question of what can you do about this? So we thought we'd invite her back to sort of address that, and then we will open it up. We have about a half an hour. Some of our panelists have a hard stop at 9 o'clock because many have traveled from quite far. So we'll have about a half an hour for questions, but Beverly first.
Thank you. Now that you have heard these excellent presentations from our panel, let's talk about what you can do. We are in the midst of a federal election, and this is an issue that needs to be discussed. So consider contacting your federal candidate and ask them where they stand on this issue. Write a letter to the national newspapers urging the editor to cover the issue. Use social media, very effective tools, Facebook and Twitter to spread the word. You could email the CBC, CTV, Global, and The Agenda with Steve Paikin and urge them to cover the issue. Contact your MPP and Premier Wynne, and if you haven't already done so, you can sign the petition. And I'll just make a couple of remarks in closing. The Great Lakes need our protection. They need responsible stewardship. They must be protected from the threat of radioactive nuclear waste being buried on their very shores. We all have a right to clean water, and we have a right and a responsibility to speak up against those who would risk contaminating it. It is wholly unacceptable that an unelected organization such as OPG would tamper with this right by gambling that its nuclear waste dump will never leak over an astounding period of 100,000 years. They don't have to create this dump. They don't have to do this. We don't think we should let them gamble with our rights. We hope that you will stand with us to stop the Great Lakes nuclear dump.
Okay, so we're going to open it up to questions. I would invite all of the panelists to turn on their microphones, and so anyone can respond to any specific question if a question is directed to them or otherwise. There's also a microphone for questions from the audience right over there. Yes. So, who will be the brave first question asker?
Thank you for those excellent presentations. I would just like to add, because it feels like a gap in the conversation, that we currently have, in addition to creating all of this nuclear waste, we have on the Ontario side alone 18 working nuclear reactors, and as many on the US side. I'm not sure how many. And the thing is, they're all old, and they all need to be shut down within the next decade. They're all coming to the end of their lives. Ontario is planning on rebuilding 10 nuclear reactors at Darlington and Bruce, locking us in for another, 4 or 5 decades. And, I think we need to stop producing nuclear waste. We also need to deal with the waste, the dump itself, and I'm with you 100%. And we also, at the same time, need to stop the production of nuclear waste, because we're going to keep needing to find more and more dumps the more we continue to create this mess. So I guess it's a comment. I'd be happy for people to comment on that, but it's not really a question. Sure it is. Would anybody like to respond or speak to that? On the American side, there's as many nuclear reactors that are old as well, right?
Your comment is appreciated, and I will just point out that regardless of whether we were to stop producing nuclear power today, there would still be a very large legacy of nuclear waste that we need to deal with responsibly.
Thank you very much for the presentation. A question for you, Beverly. You talked about a 36 million, what should we call it, incentive bribe to local communities to take the waste. Can you tell me, is that the total bill or is it per community? And how was this money dispersed? Was it to local elected officials, or do you have any more detail? Thank you very much.
It is the total, so it's 36 million over a number of years, and under the hosting agreement, there is a certain amount, a proportion per community, excuse me, per year for their support of this plan.
If I could make a comment on that, because if you support what the local politicians in that area have done, there's two things you should be holding them accountable on. One is, it is shameful for 8 years they met secretly with OPG. So you should hold them accountable no matter how you feel about this issue. The second thing, I just want to point out to you, you should hold them accountable no matter how you feel about this issue on the 36 million. 36 million for 10 to 100,000 years. And I just want to give you an example. They must have been really shrewd negotiators. The little village, when you go across the Blue Water Bridges into Port Huron, Point Edward, it's like a little Vatican place. It's right beside us. They have 450 slot machines, and they've had them for 15 years. You know how much money they've got in 15 years? $36 million. So when I look at what they negotiated, and they did it secretly, and I will say for 20 years I've been trying to get in this province the law they have in Michigan about open meetings. Mm-hmm. If this had happened in Michigan, what they did, they hold the mayor and the councillors personally, financially responsible and fine them. Not the corporation, the individuals. And yet that, because in Ontario we have, the only thing that happens here if the ombudsman goes after a municipal councillor or mayor, the penalty is embarrassment. And they walked away from that. So I think if you look at that number, it's an appalling number. They just ran circles around them for 100,000 years of nuclear waste. So when you go back to those communities, that's what you should be holding them accountable on too. How they disrespected the public process, and they brought forward a deal which is not in their interest, even if you support this.
And to add to that, the other thing is that when you read those agreements, they very clearly say that OPG on its own can decide to stop the payments if they feel that the council is no longer providing the support. So it's put council members in a situation of being afraid to speak out on the issue because of, gee, are we going to be responsible for losing this money for our community? And I showed you at the very end of the presentation, they're looking at another for the nuclear fuel bundles, and going up there and organizing with people up there, running into council members in some communities who said, I want to meet with you. I'm opposed to this other one, they're talking about the other DGR, but this one concerned too, and said, but we'll have to meet outside of the community because I don't want to be seen meeting with you, because I don't want OPG to see that I'm talking with people who are opposed. So that is a horrible taking away of the right of your elected people to speak out without a fear of losing this money.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question about what's the probability of a leak occurring, and what exactly would happen to the company if a leak actually did occur?
Great.
Well, that's a great question, and it's coming from someone who's concerned about the future, obviously. The probability is always there. It cannot be mitigated. It cannot be eliminated. And I think as Beverly clearly went through her presentation and talked about the 4 facilities that are already on the planet, all 4 of them have had. So I don't know if you could call that 100% probability, but it's very high.
Anyone else want to respond to that one?
What would happen to the company, I think she asked, and she's 12 years old? What would happen to the company? OPG.
So what would happen to OPG if...
That was her question. Sure.
Hydro bills.
I don't actually know what the full answer to that question would be. The hosting agreement does cover some aspects if there were to be an accident with protection of property values for those living within a very close distance of the waste facility. But aside from that, I'm not aware of anything. I don't know if anyone else is.
We're not like the U.S. with a super fund, a fund you can go to when there's a catastrophe, and that's always been one of our bigger issues, just on even shipping oil on the Great Lakes. If there was ever a catastrophe, it'll be the taxpayers of Canada and the U.S. that will end up picking up these costs. They just don't have the ability to finance this if something of that type of devastation occurred.
So my name is Dorothy Golden Rosenberg, and as John and many people in this room know, I've been working for many, many years on these issues. We've always included the issues of high-level and low-level nuclear wastes. I teach about environmental and ecosystem health at the University of Toronto to graduate students, and we've known for years now that there's no safe dose of ionizing radiation. There is no safe dose. So this notion of dilution and is going to be the solution is totally false. The International Agency for Research on Cancer has classified ionizing radiation as a known human carcinogen. So let nobody tell you that it can be released into the water in terms of safety. I would say that I'm a founding member of the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility with Gordon Edwards and Fred Nelman in Montreal. 30, 40 years ago, when you get old, you have a lot of history. John's nodding his head. We have history. And I would completely endorse what Angela Bischoff suggested at the beginning, that we've got to stop the production of more nuclear power. This has been a CCNR position right from the get-go, that we cannot allow to keep producing this stuff. Of course we have to deal with the waste now. There's no question. I mean, those of us who've been doing this work for all these decades know that. But if we keep producing it, and I think that needs to be part of the equation of the discussion for all of you that are talking about this issue, is in addition to the critical issues that we've named. And Beverly, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. Can we have that? Can we have a copy of your presentation for us to circulate to our lists and people and so on?
Yes, and we have taped this session, so we will have a video up on our Facebook of the entire...
It would be good to have something online that we can mail out to people, and Angela Bischoff puts out No Nuclear News. I'm sure most of you here know about it, but it's a wonderful publication that comes out regularly, full of this kind of information, so I would suggest that. The last thing that I'll say is that you should be a traveling panel going across the country and across the province, and I don't know, is there any media here, John? When you organized this, did you get...
I didn't organize it. Ask Frank, who's sitting next to you.
We invited a great deal of media.
Okay.
I am not sure if any media are here tonight.
Are you?
Okay, there is. So I see some hands up in the audience then, so that's great.
Great. Okay. Well, this is the point. What you've done here is so valuable as a public forum. And this needs to be major information. Kathleen Wynne needs to know this stuff. So I'm not sure if you can set up an appointment with her with all you wonderful speakers, or some of you wonderful speakers, to meet with Kathleen. I know her from way back when she was a school trustee, and you know what? She knows a lot. She's surrounded by the nuclear industry, people who are supportive like this. That's the problem. You're nodding your head. You know it too. So to get to her personally, she's still the premier, and she still could have some influence, but she's not hearing enough from, even though so much has gone to her. So I would let's just say how this wonderful group can get to her. So, comments, please.
So Dorothy, I actually think you have two questions. Is that right? You have the first is the question about nuclear energy generally, and the second is the question about how to strategize around accessing Premier Wynne.
Yes.
Okay.
And the whole question of stopping, adding to your discourse the important aspect of the shutting down, the decommissioning of the reactors that we have now, and not refurbishing the new ones that they're talking about.
Does anyone want to take either of those questions?
Perhaps I can respond to the political question about Kathleen Wynne. I had high expectations last June when she was elected premier. I will have to say I'm very disappointed on this basis, and it's not to deal with issues like the privatization of Hydro One. I disagree with her on that, and I will continue to lead a campaign against that. Is that on election night, she said she was going to govern for the entire province. In southwestern Ontario, where I'm from, there's only one Liberal MPP. Eastern Ontario, with very limited representation. The north, the same thing. That hasn't happened. The government of the day is governing for this era that we're in right now, this center of the universe called the GTA. And the point I'm trying to make on that, because I'm not a Toronto basher, is that if you're outside the GTA where the political base is, it's very hard to get their attention on issues. They're just not interested. And in my own area, there's been a huge battle against wind turbines. There's been other issues of significance. We simply can't get their attention. I asked the Minister of Natural Resources just a few weeks ago to meet, and his response to me was this, on a very important economic and environmental issue, his response was, he was too busy to meet, ever. I'm not making this up. His schedule is so busy for the rest of his natural life, and I suppose mine, he cannot meet. So again, and I'm not being bitter about it, I'm very disappointed because I had so expectations for her, and I think what she'll say, it's a federal issue, it's an independent panel, we should still try. I think we need to do that, and these guys are really good at trying. I actually got my phone blocked now when their number comes.
Me too.
But that's anyhow the political comment. We should try politically, but if I could just say this, what I've been asked by the media today and yesterday, there's been a lot of media leading up to this. Stephanie was on CBC across the province this morning, and there's been other media, is that until the decision is made of who the government is, and then we know the timing of this decision, and when that happens, then we go to war, provincially and federally, and we win this battle.
You've really answered my question, but I just wanted to emphasize the business that really came up more at the end, and that this process just does not seem to reflect any of the democratic values that we hold dear. I'm really happy to see State Senator Pavlov here from Michigan and the rest of you here, and hopefully together all of us can do something, as you just indicated. But it's very disturbing that such an important decision has been made by such a small group of people, and we know that federally right these days, when science has been devalued and called radical, thank you for addressing that issue earlier, whoever did, that these are not radical issues. These are issues of life and death. Thank you.
I also teach at the University of Toronto, but I teach investigative journalism. And I did interview Helen Caldecott twice. The last time she came here, there was room for 1,000, but nobody knew she was here. She wasn't given any publicity at all. Nobody wanted to hear what she had to say. But she did say this: if we merely turned off the lights when we leave a room, we wouldn't need nuclear. That's what she said, and it's true. They don't contribute at the very most 15%, and we're risking the death of the globe for between 6 and 15% that we would not need. I myself have gone from turning off the lights to actually turning off the panel that governs my bedroom when I go to sleep, and I get a lot better sleep. We could save billions by just going into the conservation, and we would not need any more nuclear plants. She is a doctor. She has seen the results in humanity of radiation. The Pacific is now dead, for those of you who don't know, and the West Coast, people are being born now with many mutations. That also is not news. We do not need the nuclear mafia. We do not need to boil water in such a ridiculous way, and I'm quoting Einstein. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Paul Baines. I'm with a group called Great Lakes Commons, and I have a question for the panel. But I first want to say thanks to the speakers and many of the comments tonight. I'll try to keep this brief. You know, what I heard sitting in the audience was that there's no rules being broken here, right? Like, we've built this sort of perfect trap for insane decisions to pass through our system. And as we heard from Councillor Mike Layton at the beginning, there's issue after issue. Every generation has a brand new issue. And so what I'm hearing, as not really a young or an old person, but somewhere in the middle, that we've been down this road before. Now, yes, we can keep thinking that the next government, the next campaign, more signatures in the petition. I support all of those initiatives to work as hard as we can. Great Lakes Commons was founded by Council of Canadians and a group called On the Commons as a way to create a new story for how we want to relate to water. We can continuously try to reacting to these broken rules that allow such an insane plan to keep going ahead, or we can figure out what is it we want at the end of the day. Great Lakes Commons has a Great Lakes Commons Charter to protect the waters as a shared and sacred commons. And so I wanted to know from each of the panelists if they'd heard of the Great Lakes Commons Initiative, would they consider signing the charter, and do they think that we need a more proactive approach to dealing with not just the nuclear issues on one side of the border, but on both sides of the border, not just for the ones we have, but for the ones that we're sort of going to refurbish, and for many of the other issues that we are constantly reacting to. And, you know, this is all of our responsibility, but we are reacting. We are not thinking about what is our long-term plan of perpetual care as being great ancestors. And so I'd just like to hear from the panelists on their thoughts about a new sort of story, new sets of rules, because these rules obviously allow such projects to go ahead. And it's up to us now to, the burden of proof is on our end and not on their end. And so thoughts on new visions, new plans, not just to work amongst Canadians and Americans, states and provinces, but especially with First Nations in the area as well. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for the question. I'll start. I'm not aware, but I'm from Michigan. I follow a different set of circumstances there. But what I would say is that if you're not willing to engage now, it's going to be very difficult to engage once this decision has been made. And it doesn't matter what form of government you have. I can just talk in experiences that when we get on a pathway of acceptance or what becomes a popular consensus, which I think is what the scientific community is talking about here in Ontario, that this is a safe, reliable form of disposal. Number one, it's very difficult to pull that apart. It becomes more and more difficult with each new government that you have, because once the first shovel goes in the ground and it goes beyond a plan, it's going to be very difficult to make the case that it shouldn't go forward. So the other thing that I would also like to say is, and I didn't mention it in my comments, but while this is being considered for a low to intermediate level radioactive waste facility now, it's not going to be hard for them to make the case that, wow, this thing has lasted 5 years and we haven't had any problem with it. Maybe it's a solution for our high-level radioactive waste. And so to me, it looks like it's short steps to, high-level radioactive waste going there. So you need to not only leverage, your time here tonight, but also go through your phone and find 50 contacts that also view clean water in a great environment the same way, because it's going to become increasingly more difficult to put this genie back in the bottle.
The one comment I would make on this is the regulatory bodies. Doesn't that sound very comforting? And I can tell you in the last 2 years from dealing with rail issues, and this issue, when I was in Ottawa a few years ago for the hearing on the steam generators, I was in the back of the room and I was dozing off, and when I was dozing off, I couldn't tell when the speaker was speaking as chairman of the board of the commission and the proponent. I'm serious. And what happens with these regulatory bodies, and I know it happens in the US too, there's almost this Stockholm syndrome where they come together and the regulator is not doing what they should do. And if you've been to these hearings, you will see the relationships. It's personal, and it's defensive, and it's cheerleading. That needs to change. Those regulatory bodies need to be different. The other thing that needs to happen is we need, and this would affect my community, we need to take strict control of industrial location in proximity to the rivers and lakes of this Great Basin. That's a very difficult challenge, but I know that we're addressing that, and you should not be able to discharge in the manner that does happen directly into rivers and Great Lakes. We're beyond that. We're way beyond that with technology. So there are two things. I'd just like to see a limitation, whether it be 10 kilometers or 5 kilometers, you simply can't do it. That would make a big difference on both sides of the Great Lakes.
And I guess I'll just comment to add to what Senator Pavlo said. In the time allowed, there's only so much we can discuss, but Senator Pavlo hit the nail right on the head. This Kincardine nuclear waste dump, we have to view it as a Trojan horse. Because if it is approved, as he said, it is quite possible that the high-level nuclear waste, which is the nuclear spent fuel, will be put into this repository. It's only the stroke of a pen that might stand between that and the nuclear fuel going in there.
One other thing I want to add in terms of what we have to be working for, and what's always heartening is it's the local community people who really see what the threats are and who really come forward and start fighting those. The unfortunate thing is that in recent years on both levels of government, we've seen a removal by government of some of the basic rights that the public has had and the communities have had to be involved in hearings and to be able to have the substantial impact. We went through those 33 days of hearings. You can't cross-examine the witnesses. All you can do is ask a question of the chair of the hearing and say, will you please pass it on and ask them to answer it. There's no, that fundamental rights have actually deteriorated in the last 20 years. And we have to make sure that we stand up for our rights and insist on those, because it is the local communities that see it and will make the difference and are making the difference.
Okay, I think we have time for one or two more questions.
Okay, mine will be quite short. My name's Cheryl Grace. I live in Southampton, Ontario, in Bruce County. I'm also a council member for the town of Saugeen Shores. About a month ago, we received a communication from OPG sending us a news story from Vice.com written by a man named Arthur White. And it says that an unnamed State Department representative told Vice News that along with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, They are participating in the Canadian review process and said they consider it to be the appropriate channel for providing U.S. input on this proposal, and they have no plans to call for the binational review that the Senators Stabenow, Peters, and Representative Kildee are asking for. So I was pretty disturbed by this. I wondered, Senator Pavlo, if you know anything about that.
Well, I could speak all night about our Environmental Protection Agency and the impact that they've had not only on our state, on our country from an economic standpoint. Let me just leave you with this. I don't know why they're not taking a serious look at this, yet it was just announced about 2 or 3 months ago. I also passed a resolution in the Michigan State Senate because the EPA is now looking to regulate our backyard barbecues, if you can imagine such a thing. So how they can put such a focus on a barbecue activity in your backyard and not take a serious look at a long-term nuclear waste repository, just it doesn't really leave me with much confidence in that agency. So to suggest that they've signed off on this, I really don't see the rationale in that.
Good evening, and gentlemen. I've participated in these hearings, but I have a couple quick messages for support for what this panel has said. But there's also one of the most important points that have been made is the failure of 3 repositories within a very short time. How does OBG, how can they possibly claim to build the only successful DGR? That is something that could resonate with people. I mean, this is what, and politicians. I'm glad you brought up about the collusion between the regulatory agencies, the provincial government, which says absolutely nothing at these hearings, and OPG. It is absolutely horrible to witness and see. That has to stop. I'm glad that we have 2 politicians out here. We need more politicians, and I think we need to aim, all of us, and to spread the word to get politicians involved in this issue. Money talks. How much money has OPG, which is our money, planned to build this? How much? We don't know. We know nothing. Science talks. Science says, when in doubt, refrain. That has not happened. The final point I want to make. I know we're very concerned about building a DGR on the Great Lakes. People have said it's the nuclear industry, it's the collusion with the nuclear industry and the government that keeps this industry going. We don't have a solution, and people have to admit that as to what to do with nuclear waste. Burying it is not necessarily a solution. In the meantime, the best thing that could be advocated is leave it above ground and wait until you have that. Storing it somewhere else in Canada, Senator Pavlov, why would we want to put this on another community? That is a problem.
Well, I appreciate your comment on putting it somewhere else in Canada. I will tell you that part of our lacking in a national energy policy in the United States is that we began down the road for a facility in Yucca Mountain, Nevada, and the current administration has stopped the funding for that. There needs to be a long-term solution, and I would never come before this body or a body in Michigan and suggest that we don't have a problem on our hands. But I will suggest that there needs to be a long-term solution, one that has safety at the very front of that conversation and not creating additional problems, whether it be for fresh water or fresh air. So we're responsible for a solution. I'm here to help work on that solution. I just don't think 700 yards off the shores of Lake Huron is the first choice.
I think we have time for one brief question.
I guess that's me. You're looking at somebody who was trained in science. I wouldn't claim to be a genius at this, but one who has experienced what's gone on. I've got no thyroid, and that came about from radiation. I've got 2 points to make here right now, which I think are relevant, and they're slightly different in their tack. The first one is that if you were to ever contemplate a nuclear industry, 2 factors would exclude it right from the start, other than through us shareholders. The first one is to insure it in the capital markets. There is no chance that you can do this. I actually tried to do this because I used to play in those fields, and they said, you must be kidding. Unless there's a sovereign risk behind it, we won't even look at it. Or if we do, you won't be able to afford it. You then look at the financial side of putting one of these things together, and indeed that says from cradle to grave, and we keep looking at one end of it or in the middle, but in the end it's the grave. And if you look at Sellafield in the UK, they're up to 110 billion pounds right now to decommission. Now, they may have made some mistakes, but that's a big number. The next thing, and the only second point I'd like to make, Madam Chairman, is to do with essentially the appearance, and I'm going to say this is my view, the appearance of conflict in the setup which is in place. This has to do with the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. It receives 2/3 of its money from the nuclear industry. All I'm going to do is leave you to write the rest of my story there, but that seems to me to smack of they rubber stamp everything, because by so doing they keep going. If they were to say no to something, excuse me, their fees will go down. That strikes me as being in business, as you can probably tell I came from that end, that this would not be allowed, that you in fact are going to be the fox watching the chickens. And that's the model I'd like to leave you with. 3 things that I'd like you to consider.
Any specific comments on that question or final comments? Yes, next time you can also be a panelist. No? Okay, so in closing, I would obviously like to thank our panel for their good work here today, but also to thank all of you for your insightful questions and comments. Frank tells me that there is some literature on a table somewhere on the way out. So if you are interested in further information, you can pick it up on the way out. And yeah, thank you very much.